Hi everyone, it's Clara, and I'm going to go over the history of Vinyasa Yoga. There'll be nothing to see, just me chatting it up, so feel free to close your eyes or just quite simply lie down and receive this information. Yoga is a very old practice. And Vinyasa Yoga is not a very old practice. Vinyasa Yoga, as we know it today, has really been around since the 60s and 70s. And so I wanted to give a little bit of context to what it is that you are learning from me in terms of the lineage. So yoga, as we know, has been around for many, many centuries. And generally it is thought of, or in the sacred texts of like the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita, it is thought of as meditation. Generally yoga is translated, as you already know, meaning union, yoke, to bring two things together or to join two things to yoke. And yoga as we know it here in the West in terms of Hatha yoga, Hatha being the practical, the physical aspects of yoga, is only been around since, as we know it, has been around since Krishnamacharya was born. So Krishnamacharya was born in the late 1900s and essentially created a lot of the asanas as we know of them today. Along with his disciples. So you have an article about Krishnamacharya, so I won't go too much into it. Read about it, and we'll definitely discuss it when we come back together. But Krishnamacharya is known, I call him as the forefather of yoga as we know it today in the West, and he's my great grandfather of yoga. From Krishnamacharya, Pattabhi Jois, one of the three disciples that essentially brought yoga to the West from Krishnamacharya, Pattabhi Jois, who created Ashtanga Yoga based off of Karma Yoga or Krama Yoga, Krama Yoga from Krishnamacharya. He created Ashtanga Yoga, which is the primary series, the secondary and the third series, and they are a set series that you do every single time. Vinyasa was born out of Ashtanga Yoga. And so Vinyasa Yoga takes a lot of what Ashtanga had and it changed it up. So the primary, the secondary, and the third series are set series, and you generally do only to the point that you can in your body. And then after that, you go back to the beginning. And a lot of the times in Ashtanga Yoga classes, traditionally, at least in India and Mysore, it was a Mysore practice is what it's called. That's what you'll find it if you ever see it on the schedule. And that is you move at your own pace and the teacher walks around and adjusts and gives you feedback in terms of your practice. So Pattabhi Jois, right, was teaching in Mysore and he was teaching Ashtanga Yoga. And and he is my grandfather specifically of me. And then my teachers all studied with, or some of my teachers studied directly with Pattabhi Jois, or they studied with people who had studied with him. So the first teachers that I studied with are David Life and Sharon Gannon in New York City at a place called Jivamukti. They were pretty much my first, or David was one of my first teachers, and Uma, one of their students who became one of their senior teachers, was my teacher. And so if you've ever taken Jivamukti Yoga, it actually, not as much anymore, but definitely in the 90s, was sticking closer to the primary series in terms of the format of the class, but they added what they would call Bhakti Yoga. So in every Jivamukti class, you'll experience a mantra at the beginning. There's always a Dharma talk. They usually have a theme of the month, and you go through the practice, and at the end, there's usually meditation. And so they have added those other components to the primary series. Now, if you go to a Jivamukti class, it's a lot more Vinyasa based, meaning that it's creative. So Vinyasa Yoga differs from Ashtanga Yoga in that it takes a lot of the same format, but every class is generally very different depending upon the lineage of Vinyasa Yoga. And so in New York, this is a little bit of my history because it is now your history since you're studying with me. So I studied at Jivamukti for a couple of years, and then went and studied, I got my 200-hour training with Lauren Hanna and Jonathan Fields. I had to pull their names, and they opened a studio called Sonic Yoga, and Lauren was a she studied with Shiva Ray, so she's from Prana Flow, and Jonathan Fields studied with Beryl and Baptiste, which is power yoga. So my lineages come from more of the creative force in terms of who I learned how to teach from. And Shiva Ray became what I like to call, what she would call one of my root teachers, meaning somebody that I've studied with. I've studied with her off and on since 2003, and she has highly influenced the way that I teach and the way that I format my class. So, and then if you've ever taken power yoga or Beryl and Baptiste style, it's also Beryl, Bender, Birch. It has more, it's a much more fiery practice. I usually, if we were talking about this vinyasa practice specifically, it would be more of an earth and a fire practice, longer holds, bigger poses in terms of getting big muscle groups to work. And so it creates a lot of heat, a lot of tapas, a lot of heat in the practice. Where Shiva Ray, she has many different things, but I would consider her more of a fluid. She has more of a water element. It's definitely water and fire, but it has more of a movement, and I'm doing it right now. It has this like flowy quality to it. And Shiva's big belief is that we're made up of 75% water. So why are we thinking of ourselves like a solid instead of a liquid? So it's important for us to remember the fluidity in our bodies, and it's a very natural way of moving. At least it is for me. And so when I studied with Shiva for the first time, I was like, yes, I'm home. These are all the things that I really feel in a yoga class, or the way that I want to feel when I'm dancing with my body. So coming back in to the lineages here. So people who studied with Pattabhi Jois, and this is generally in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they brought back Ashtanga Yoga into the West, and then they started to, a lot of them, including David and Sharon and a couple of other teachers, started to kind of take the primary series and mix it up a little bit and mix it on its head. And that's where Vinyasa Yoga, as we know it here in the West, was born. Vinyasa generally translates to place in a sacred way, right? Other people think of it as like a flow. It's flowing between breath and movement. And so it has a lot more, it focuses more on transitions than other styles of yoga, right? The other styles of yoga being like Hatha yoga, restorative, yin, Anusara has kind of become defunct and kind of moved closer to Hatha yoga. So all of those practices are usually a little bit more static, especially yin and restorative, they're closer to the ground. So when we do Vinyasa yoga, we're really, really flowing, generally one breath, one movement. And then a couple of the other key components that make Vinyasa yoga, how they differ from other styles of yoga are this. We generally have a peak pose, so we're working towards something. So the warm up before the first 20 to 35 minutes are generally working towards a peak pose. And most of the other styles like Hatha, all the other styles generally don't have, including hot yoga, I forgot hot yoga in there, don't generally have a peak pose. They're thinking more of like creating a holistic practice, meaning that they're touching on all components of the body, the what I like to call the 5 family of poses, right? The hips, the shoulder, hip openers, arm balances, inversions, twists, and standing leg balances. And in Vinyasa yoga, most of the time, we are generally working towards a peak pose. So that's how we differ from Ashtanga yoga as well as all the other styles. How we also differ specifically from Ashtanga yoga is that we play music, where in traditional Ashtanga classes, there's no music. Your breath is the metronome of the practice, which is very, very powerful. And I also think that music is a wonderful way of creating bhavana, and bhavana meaning mood. And so we, in Vinyasa, specifically in the Vinyasa classes that the teachers that I've studied with, and definitely what I'm teaching, is it's a theme. We're heavy on the theme, and we link the theme exoterically, meaning in the physical body, and esoterically in the mind, right, the subtle body. And so we're weaving that through the breath, and through the music will help to kind of create that mood. We're working towards a peak pose. right? And so that's how we differ specifically from Ashtanga, from our roots. Now, how we are tied to our roots to Ashtanga Yoga is we generally offer Ujjayi breath, right? The victorious warrior breath. Hopefully we're teaching bandhas and talking about bandhas, and those come from the Ashtanga practice, and they come from the lineage of Krishnamacharya for sure. And hopefully a little bit of meditation, yeah? So those are the ways that we are tied to Ashtanga, and then how we differ is the peak pose and the music, definitely, right? And so that, in a nutshell, is what Vinyasa Yoga is and what the history of the lineage as you know it. And so Shiva being my teacher, so those are my parents are Shiva Ray, David Life, Uma Saraswati. And then I also studied quite a few. I believe one thing I love about Vinyasa Yoga is that I call us the cut and pasters of the yoga community, because we have the ability, depending upon the lineage, to kind of draw from all kinds of other styles, where at least I feel like in Yin and restorative, like you're sticking to a pretty tight-knit format. And so at least in my own history, I've studied Yin, or I've studied restorative, I should say. I've studied a lot of Anusara, I've studied Iyengar, I've studied Ashtanga in its traditional sense, as well as Vinyasa. So what I like to do is weave all of those components together. And then I also weave in some strength training that I've learned from my physical therapists and massage therapists after having unfortunately injured my body a couple of times. So I like to bring in those components. So one thing to really think about when you're, or one thing I'd like you to think about on this break is I'd love you to draw out what I like to call your family tree. So start with who your teachers are, and start there. And then move above them, and if you can, remember who their teachers are, and see if you can link yourself all the way back to Krishnamacharya, because technically we should all be, our family tree takes us back to Krishnamacharya. So on this break, what I'd love you to do is draw out your family tree, okay? Next piece of homework that I'd love you to do on this break is define what Vinyasa Yoga is for you. Second question is, why do you practice yoga? The third question is, why do you teach yoga? And the last question is, what would you like your students to experience in your class? So I'll give that all again, because that was a lot. Define Vinyasa Yoga for yourself. Why do you practice yoga? Why do you teach yoga? And what would you like your students to experience in your class?